It is with real pleasure that I ask Lee to address us on her topic, Falling in Love with Maths, Morality and Mercy, her conversion story. Leah Libresco.
Well, thank you all so much for having me in. I've never been to New Zealand before, and it's been a real pleasure so far. I'd like to start this talk. We're still in the octave of Easter right now. We're looking forward to Divine Mercy Sunday tomorrow. But I'd like to look a little further past that, even that, to the next great feast that's coming down, the Feast of Pentecost, where when the Holy Spirit descended on the apostles, they found themselves speaking tongues they themselves didn't understand, so that God's word and God's love could go out to every people, so that kind of the parochialism of the first apostles would never be a barrier to reaching everyone on earth, speaking to them in the language that they understood. And I think we think about Pentecost in terms of literal language a lot of the time. I'd be surprised to find myself speaking Arabic. But in my own life, God reached out to me speaking the language I was fluent in, which wasn't really English so much as math and weird bits of philosophy, and sometimes Broadway musicals, which might have been even more surprising to the apostles to find themselves preaching to people, not even just starting with, here is Christ, here's who he is, but, Plato, let us discuss the history of mathematics, and we're going to work our way over to God as we get there. And I think part of the reason, for me that it worked that way is because it's hard when you're starting a new language to say anything of much significance in it, I kind of had this moment where I needed more preparation and more training in the language of Christianity to even begin to understand what Christianity was and be able to make a choice about conversion. Because I remember when I was taking ASL lessons for a little while, American Sign Language lessons, most of the things I learned were the things you learn when you just start learning a language. So I could say, my name is Leah. I have one brother. And then my teacher would kind of pull me into little dialogues, and she would say, what did you do last weekend? And I would go, I went to the theater, simple things. Now, she worked for a church at the time when she wasn't giving ASL tutoring sessions, and she thought a reasonable question to ask someone who'd had 2 months of ASL was, you don't believe in God, why? And there I was with 2 months of ASL, so I could tell her what color clothes I was wearing, and I could tell her how old all my siblings were, and I could specify I lived in an apartment, but I was kind of stuck as to how to begin to address that question and go, I don't give a name to what I don't know? I was stuck. And for me, kind of growing up, I started with a disfluency in Christianity in some ways that had to be remedied before I could come to the point of understanding God. And when I say disfluency, what I mean is that, Christianity was not a part of my life growing up. I grew up in America, in New York, on Long Island. And where I lived, most of the people I went to school with were all fairly secular Jews. So I didn't know anyone who kind of talked about their experience of living as a Christian. In fact, I so didn't know people who were Christian, and neither did people in my class, that when we took AP European history, and we're going over the history of Europe and the history of the Reformation, one of the kids in my class raised their hand, it wasn't me, I promise, and said, we're learning about Luther. Do Lutherans still exist? Because I didn't know. So for me, a lot of growing up and learning about Christianity, I learned about it only where it was politically in conflict with whatever I was doing or believed in. So I learned about it if, a Christian made a comment on TV about a hurricane being a punishment for homosexuality, because that was on TV and was a political issue. But I didn't learn very much about what everyday Christian lives were. And again, if you think about learning a new language, the most important things for me to learn about the gospel story were not, how does this all interact with every hot-button political issue of the day? Even if you look today, a lot of friends I have who aren't Catholic, what do they hear about Pope Francis? The first thing they might hear is, oh, he's writing a very controversial encyclical on global warming, which flows from his Catholic faith, but is not the heart of the Catholic faith. He would never say, let me tell you about God and his love for us, and let me start by discussing the appropriate conservation strategies over the next 20 to 30 years to minimize the impact of global warming. It's just not at the heart of the faith. But what I tended to encounter was things that were, at the heart of political discourse. So that didn't really change for me until I went to college and I started meeting Christians who were active Christians who liked talking about their religion. But, I didn't grow up languageless, let's say. My ethics weren't Christian ethics, but I certainly had some. So what I grew up as, the language that I was fluent in, the language that God needed to speak to me in order to be able to speak to me at all, was something that's called deontology, which is kind of a very rule-based system of morality. The person who's best known for this is Immanuel Kant, where he says you should think all the time when you make a choice about what choice you would want everyone else to make in your position and do that thing. You shouldn't make any choice yourself that couldn't apply to everyone else. And you should never break these rules. And what that meant, practically speaking, I kind of learned this both in the abstract philosophical way, and I was moved by examples of beautiful deontologists. You don't think of there being a lot of sacred art of deontology, but you'd be wrong. There's beautiful sacred art of deontology. I wonder how many people here have ever seen the musical or the movie Les Miserables? Yeah? And you probably had a favorite character. How many people's favorite character was Javert? I guess it's only me then. I loved Javert because when I saw him, he's this police inspector who pursues Jean Valjean, the convict who's a very good person, ruthlessly. And I liked him because he was very attentive to duty. He said, what am I required to do? And it doesn't matter if it's hard for me. I need to do whatever is right. And that's who I wanted to be. And I liked that Javert was uninterested in mercy. That's why he doesn't forgive Jean Valjean. But he doesn't not forgive Jean Valjean because he hates him or because he specifically persecutes him. Javert doesn't believe in mercy for anyone, and he certainly doesn't believe in it for himself. Javert loves morality much too much to believe in mercy, and that's how I felt too. But the way I thought about it is, morality is the standard by which we measure human action, in the same way a ruler is the standard by which we measure length. And if a ruler contracted itself to make things look bigger, out of pity for them, out of mercy for them, if I stood next to a yardstick and it said that I was 5'9" because it knew I wanted to be taller, and just kind of squinched down so that I could feel tall, it wouldn't be a very good ruler. It would be a ruler that had warped itself, out of pity for me, who is only 5'6". And that's how I felt when I heard people talk about mercy, It felt like, in the same way the ruler was contorting itself to make me feel better, that mercy is morality saying, oh, you're not very good at this, are you? Let me see what I can do to make you feel better about yourself. I forgive you. You hurt someone, you fell short of your duty. It doesn't matter, And I felt this would be an insult to duty and to ethics, in the same way Javert does. So, I admired him for being kind of, as I thought of it, brave enough to say, I'd rather be judged wanting, but have morality remain objective and strong and clear, and have it just be acknowledged that it's me who isn't good enough, than for anyone to say, no, you're fine the way you are. So that's kind of how I came into college. And what happened for me is college was the place where I started to meet Christians, and see the heart of their faith and kind of have interesting conversations with them. Because again, as I'd grown up, most of what I knew of Christians was kind of, in America, evangelical Christianity that spends a lot of its time arguing about evolution or other things, that seem, well, first of all, isn't really, again, at the heart of the gospel story, but is also demonstrably false. So I came into college thinking there aren't really any smart Christians in the world, they're just kind of very politically active, annoying people. And I was surprised because I came to college and I started meeting very weird smart Christians, who were weird both in that they were smart and in that they were Christian and in that they grounded their Christianity in the kinds of languages I was more fluent in. I met Christian mathematicians who I thought, were kind of my people. Not Christianity's people, my people. And what I thought was, I have misjudged Christianity. It is not trivial to prove it wrong. I probably need to put a little work into it. So I should meet these people and learn more about them and then explain to them why they're wrong. I didn't think they were right. I just thought, okay, I'll need to put in a little work to explain why they're wrong. And so, since I'm an enormous nerd, what work meant usually was reading. So I spent a lot of time, reading Chesterton, reading Lewis, reading a little bit of Dostoevsky to kind of understand what it was I was dealing with. Because what it really exposed to me is that I wasn't fluent in what my friends believed. I thought I kind of understood exactly what Christianity was, and I didn't. So I had to spend some time picking up vocabulary, understanding where they were coming from and what they believed. And where I was really lucky is I was part of a debate organization in college. And the reason I think of that as a very lucky stroke is it meant I wasn't kind of just encountering Christianity head on. Or I don't know if you've kind of had the unproductive conversation that's kind of an all-proof conversation of why are you a Christian, outline your proof for Christianity, and you spend your whole time arguing about the why you believe, but not the what you believe. So you don't get to give much of a portrait of, once you agree, what does that mean for you? And so I've had some debates about, is God real, yes or no? I had debates about the ethics of capital punishment, or how children should be schooled, or, well, we had all kinds of debates. We had debates on, what we owe the poor, And none of these were debates about Christianity. They were debates in which my Christian friends kind of brought their Christianity to their arguments, and I could see what it meant for them. I could see where our approaches differed. So that was an enormous gift because it started to expose to me what their Christianity looked like, besides just on paper, well, they all like the Bible an awful lot, I guess. And so that kind of actually wound up exposing for me one big place where we differed that I wasn't sure I was in the right. So when I was in college, I was, in a debate group. You can imagine those sometimes get a little fractious, a little aggressive. I was in the middle of a very low-stakes fight that became kind of a very highly charged disagreement, as low-stakes fights tend to be, with another kid about how to organize a debate we were having. And it became very vicious back and forth, and I was upset about this. And so I was talking to my friend, my boyfriend at the time, who was Catholic, and he said, wow, Madison, not her name, is really going after you on this. She's been really mean to you, and I'm sorry about that. I'm going to pray for Madison. And I said, why would you pray for Madison? I mean, she's been mean to me, but that's my problem. That's not Madison's problem. As far as I understand it, what you're proposing is that you're going to go tattle on Madison to God and say, dear God, Madison has been very mean to Leah, and Leah is too much of a wuss to handle it. Please make Madison a little nicer to Leah so that she doesn't have to work as hard to be nice back. Because remember, I was a deontologist, so I thought it doesn't matter what anyone else is doing, it matters what I do. And if Madison is mean or if Madison is nice, it's irrelevant to me. I have the same job, which is to be nice to Madison. And it sounded cowardly to me to ask God, if God even existed, but that wasn't the point of disagreement I had that day. It sounded cowardly to say, would someone please be nicer to me so I don't have to do my job? It sounded again like asking the ruler to flex so I could be tall. And so I didn't understand at all why he was doing this. I said, Chris, I don't want you to pray for that. Like, if God existed, I wouldn't want to ask him that. And he said, Leah, I'm not praying for Madison so that you can have a nicer week. I want to pray for Madison because it's probably exhausting for Madison to be this angry at you. It's not good for her, regardless of whether it's good for you to practice being nice to bad people. And what I realized is I hadn't really thought of it that way. And I want to be fair, I think probably other deontologists are nicer people than I was. I was a little kind of tunnel visioned as a deontologist. So don't go out and meet people who are deontologists and assume that they were kind of as, focused only on themselves as I was. But the way I felt was that ethical choices were kind of like a standardized test, where I have a bunch of questions and I want to get the right answer on every single question. And how the questions are set up and who the other people are involved is irrelevant. What's important to me is what's in my control, and my actions are in my control. Madison's actions are outside my control. So I want to be as good as I can be, and everything else is irrelevant. And what I noticed when I had this fight about whether it made sense to pray for Madison is that from my perspective, it didn't even really matter whether Madison was a real person or not. If you said, oh man, Leah, you've just had this tough week, and Madison's been mean to you, what do you want to do? I'd want to pick the right answer. If you said, hey Leah, imagine you had a tough week, what would you want to do? I'd want to pick the same answer, and the two situations felt exactly the same to me. So it's almost as though the reality of Madison was irrelevant. And I didn't know how to fix this problem at the time, but I thought, that doesn't seem right. If I imagine how ethics work, it should probably matter that there are other people involved. Probably something else matters besides just my own choices. It shouldn't be irrelevant whether Madison is real or a hypothetical question I'm trying to answer. And what I kind of thought, as my friend was saying, think about Madison, that anger is hard for Madison. That it wasn't just a question of saying, oh, I'd like this to be easier. I'd like Madison to be a different person so I don't have to deal. It felt to me like almost I was trying to extinguish her, right? Like here's Madison, who is angry, and I'm asking God to get rid of her and replace her with a new Madison, who's nicer. And that seemed violent to me, right? But what I didn't think about is that there's kind of a truest version of Madison. And that version of Madison isn't as hampered by anger. That it might be easier for Madison. That she might just be happier or be less frustrated or, including less frustrated by me, and that would still be true to her. It wouldn't be erasing her. That I would have been wrong to essentialize her anger and say, no, that's the truest part of Madison, and I want her to exist as she is. And this started to kind of play a little bit of havoc with my own philosophy. So I kept reading, because what this kind of gave me a sense of is that there's some kind of like truest self that is better than your own self, and I could be in alliance with the best part of Madison and want to bring it out rather than just respond to her as well as possible as she did anything. And what I wound up finding is, so I was still reading books that my Christian friends had recommended me, and I was looking for books to hand back to them, especially as I started dealing with this kind of weakness in my deontology. And I had a lot of trouble finding books I wanted to give back, books that were atheist books that were kind of summarizing my philosophy to this date. And part of that is just because when you look at kind of what the priorities of a lot of public atheists are, they're not philosophers. They're not their job to be philosophers. A lot of people are writing on political subjects. And in America, a lot of the church-state disagreements tend to be political disagreements. How will we organize science classes again? So it makes sense that people like Dawkins are not writing discussions of, yes, here I am, solving the problems of deontology for Leah Libresco. I know she was waiting. He's writing on science education. So I was having trouble finding people who were writing the books I wanted to hand back. But finally, after reading Lewis and actually really liking parts of Mere Christianity and The Great Divorce, I went, don't worry, Chris. I have finally found someone I agree with. I've just read this book called After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, which outlines something called virtue ethics. And I think this is what I actually think. I think what virtue ethics describes is that we are called to be some kind of better version of ourselves, and that's our truest self. And really, if I were going to say the number one difference between it and deontology, deontology likes when all your moral choices are hard. In deontology, it's much better when you're nice to someone kind of against your own will. For me to be nice to Madison while she was being mean to me, because my choice isn't tainted by liking her, and it's not tainted by thinking she'll be nice to me later. I can be nice to her in perfect confidence she'll be mean to me, and then be glad that I'm not being selfish or courting her being pleasant to me. But virtue ethics just wants you to be a nice person, to make the kind of choices that are ethical, but to have it feel easy and natural. And it doesn't look at it being easy or natural as weakness. The way I kind of put it is that virtue ethics makes morality as graceful as the way a dancer walks. Because if you've seen, ballet dancers, not even when they're dancing, when they just move across the room, there's this intentionality and grace in every movement because they're so alive in their own bodies. And I don't walk like that at all. But ideally, I would make ethical choices like that. That when I came to a choice, it wouldn't be a matter of pushing past my own will and my own selfishness and, triumphing by force, which is often how Javert makes his choices, right? He has a hard choice to make, and then he makes it forcefully. But really, I'd want to move like a dancer, ethically. I'd want it to just feel like a natural extension of my own will. I'd want my will to be well-educated and aligned with the good, not a matter of wrenching myself back into alignment. And so I read this book by Alistair MacIntyre, and I felt it had laid that all out. And it was beautiful, and it was true, and it's what I wanted. And, he was on my team, so I said, Alistair MacIntyre, After Virtue. I have finally found someone I agree with. You asked me to find someone who agreed with me, and here it is, this is the book. And my boyfriend said, you know Alistair MacIntyre converted to Catholicism, right? Like, you know he didn't think that system held up. And I said some words that I'm not going to repeat in front of, this very dignified body, because I felt this was a betrayal. Alistair MacIntyre had done good work for my team. And the way I saw it, maybe it was harder to figure out how to put this all together, but he should have stuck with it. Again, kind of the worrying about Catholicism being the coward's way out. So he chose to glom on to this 2,000-year-old system that's had a lot of time to figure out how it wants to present itself, rather than forge out of, nothing a better philosophy. Loser. But, if Alistair MacIntyre wasn't up to the job, it was up to me. So I spent a lot of time both in writing and in disagreements and in conversations trying to figure out what didn't work about virtue ethics for me and what I needed to do to make it coherent. And so I'll kind of save you the time of all the different avenues I explored. And here was the hardest part about virtue ethics for me. It was the question of when you frame, ethics as a virtue ethics thing, as though there's kind of your best self, this teleological self, this you that you are aiming for. Where does it come from? Deontology was easier, because the question of what is ethical was just, what would you want everyone else to do in the situation? And that seemed fair and was kind of a nice rule. And virtue ethics was kind of more open-ended and forward-pointing. Who should you be? What does it look like to be this graceful and ethical and joyful? What is your truest self? What is Madison kind of freed from her anger, where that's a chain on her, not her own self? What's me freed from my disinterest in Madison's well-being, because that's more of myself than the me who kind of doesn't care about her? And I was kind of stuck as to how we knew what this was. Where does this essentially transcendental idea come from? Because that's a little harder to build up in atheism as a philosophy. But luckily, I felt I had kind of some prior tools to help me along. Because, teleological selves in virtue ethics weren't the first kind of transcendental system I'd encountered. I already really liked math. And math is kind of the one transcendental thing that almost everyone agrees is transcendental. And when I say transcendental, I mean it's permanent and outside of us. It has nothing to do with people. People study math, but they don't make math. When a mathematician discovers a theorem, they didn't write that theorem in the way we write a novel. They uncovered it. Mathematics is a lot like archaeology. The whole world is already out there, and mathematicians kind of chip away and reveal what was already in the world from the very beginning, which is very romantic and beautiful. And if you take nothing out of this talk, go out and become hobbyist mathematicians, right? But that is an example of kind of a transcendental beauty and a transcendental truth that most people acknowledge as transcendental. Most people don't go, oh yes, very clever of people to invent mathematics. That idea of prime numbers, jolly good, We don't take credit for it. We just know that we have knowledge of it. I felt ethics kind of work the same way. We're not making this, we're uncovering it. The trouble was, it's clearer to see how you work out what math is than how you work out what morals are. And there are a variety of ways that people say, how do we, kind of limited, finite beings, have knowledge of math? And the one I like is the one that Plato used, which is kind of nice and simple, which is, we look at the world around us and we see lots of things that resemble math, that are kind of shadows of math. So, I look at my feet, and there are 2 of them. And I look at these mics, and there are 2 of them. And there's not much that's similar between my feet and these mics, except that there are 2 of each of them. So the thing that they're aligned along, the thing that's both similar about both of them is they participate, and this is how Plato says it, they participate in the form of two-ness, which I know sounds kind of a little weird, but what he means is they both resemble this transcendental thing, this two, which you never see the quantity two bereft of physical objects wandering about the world, right? You see two shoes, you see two people, but it'd be weird to go, oh yeah, I saw two the other day. What? I saw two. Two what? The platonic form of two-ness, like just heading down the street. But by looking at all these physically instantiated things, we go, okay, I can reason about two. And, I don't know exactly what it is, like what are numbers when they're not doing anything else? I don't know. But they're the thing that unites these mics and my feet. And that's enough. If you can get to two-ness, good. And I can get to oneness, there's one lectern, and there's, let's see, one Guadalupe, Lady of Guadalupe there. All right, I've got oneness, I've got two-ness, and the cool thing about math is I'm done. If you have oneness and you have two-ness, you have all of number theory. You don't even need to derive three-ness independently from the world. You can just do it with math. And if I have all of number theory, I have literally all other forms of math that exist. Check. So I didn't spend a lot of time kind of staying up at night going, how do I, a finite being, have knowledge of mathematics? And I bet most people don't either. Partly because it's casual, we encounter it every day, and because there are a number of proofs of how we manage to reach mathematics that feel decent, But I didn't feel like I had that same kind of answer for morality. It's a lot simpler to say there are 2 feet and 2 mics, I'm good, than it is to say, oh, and how is it I have knowledge of injustice? Injustice is transcendental. Injustice isn't something I make or I define, it's something that already exists. Well, I see that boy kick a puppy, and I see that person defraud an old lady, and these 2 situations aren't much like each other, but they participate in the form of injustice. That's like a bit more of a stretch. Like, that doesn't sound as intuitive or as obvious as feet, mics, done, right? Injustice is a harder form to pin down than kind of just looking around at the world outside us. It's almost the same problem of that we can talk about vision. We can talk about seeing the world before we knew how eyes worked, right? Our ancestors didn't sit around going, I have a perception of the world outside me, but I don't understand physically how it reaches me. Maybe vision isn't real, People felt okay about that, and then later we discovered how eyes worked, and we kind of diagrammed the whole thing out. But not originally, and I felt like I was kind of at that place with conscience. I have the sense called conscience, like I have the sense called vision, and it looks at the world and it perceives features about it. My eyes perceive color and shade and light, darkness and distance, and my conscience perceives things like injustice, righteousness and duty, and I don't know how. I know how eyes work, and I don't know how consciences work. And I know how I understand math, and I don't know how I understand ethics. But there was a long period where we didn't know how eyes worked, so maybe I shouldn't work myself up too much now. It would be crazy to say I don't believe my eyes because I don't know what they do. It would be crazy now to say I don't believe my conscience because I don't know what it does. And so I kind of resolved to just keep on going. I would try and fill in these blank pieces. How do I reach up to morality? What is it that conscience responds to? And not beat myself too much up for kind of not being able to dissect conscience in the way I could dissect an eyeball. I say could dissect an eyeball because I asked to be excused from class the day we did dissect an eyeball. My knowledge of vision comes from the diagrams, not from lived experience. And so I kind of went on in that way, where, there were things that didn't quite work about my own philosophical system, but I wasn't going to give it up to accept something I didn't believe in. Right? I thought it was more worthwhile to kind of stay and dwell within those questions and look for opportunities to answer them, and not to kind of throw the whole thing out and go, well, if I can't have a consistent system, I'll just pick any consistent system. Because the way that I'd kind of felt, I'd kind of been going along 2 tracks. I'd been studying my own philosophy and trying to elucidate what didn't work about it. And I'd still been studying Catholicism because I'd been engaging with friends. I'd been dating a Catholic, though after a while I wasn't dating a Catholic. But I still had a lot of friends, and I was interested in this system. And I kind of got to the point where I felt like I had these 2 options. I had my kind of atheist virtue ethics, which didn't hold together, but where I was sure of every piece that I had. To borrow from the last speaker, I had this incomplete puzzle, and no guarantee it was able to be completed, but I was sure of every single piece. And then I had Catholicism, which I'd spent enough time studying to go, this all works, it holds together, it's consistent, but I don't think it's true. And again, as a mathematician, I was used to the idea of systems that are consistent but false. You can even think about if you've ever studied topology, or if you're going to study topology after this talk because you want to spend more time with the true, the good, and the beautiful, and topology is a good route there. You can talk about what geometry looks like on a flat sheet of paper, and that's probably the geometry you learned in class, where all triangles, have interior angles of 180 degrees, and you can't ever build a triangle out of 3 right angles, right? And so that's normal flat sheet of paper geometry. And then you can have spherical geometry, where you're looking at what shapes look like on the surface of a sphere, and they look different. You can make a triangle with 3 right angles. And flat sheet geometry and spherical geometry are both entirely consistent, but you're only going to live in one place at once, right? Only one set of rules is true wherever you happen to live. And so that's where I felt about Catholicism, which in fairness was really confusing to priests I met, where I would talk to them and go, I have some questions about Catholicism. I think it's rather like a giant sphere, where I'm not sure that I live on it, but I agree that it works as a system unto itself. And the priest would go, I'm sorry, what? And I go, oh, sorry, let me start with the history of geometry, and then we'll work our way back around to this question of religion. And I met some very patient priests, in the context of these conversations. And again, that was a question of kind of God giving me the tools to explore this question that were not, scripture, and were not prayer itself, and weren't even the lives of the saints. It was, yes, let's start from geometry and work on from there, if that's what it's going to take for this to make sense to you. So I had this choice between a system that was patchy, but where I thought it was true, a system that was whole, but I wasn't sure it was true. And so for me, what wound up being kind of a turning point is I was up for a reunion of my debate group. I was older then. I was a graduate. I was an adult. But I still had all these philosophical problems. My diploma didn't resolve them. And I kind of noticed while I was up at the debate that if I looked at the way I was framing my arguments, if I'd imagined someone coming to the debate who didn't know anything about Christianity, didn't even know it was a category, and was just trying to clump people together in the debate based on how they argued and what they appealed to. And if you listened to how I spoke and to what I cared about, you would obviously clump me together with the other Catholics in the room. And I thought this was weird. I resembled them, but it was trying to build a different parallel thing. And it kind of kept bothering me. And I'd had this happen actually even the previous alumni debate I'd gone to, where I was like, wow, it's so weird that I sound so much like a Catholic. And so it was still bothering me, and both times I had this kind of impulse to convert, but I didn't have anything to base it on besides I had a feeling, right? And for me, that didn't really matter. I just went, well, I'll note this, but it's not helpful at all. So this time, it was the second time it was bothering me, so I grabbed my friend, who was ironically a Lutheran, so thank goodness they turned out to exist. And I said, Ben, I have this problem where I come up for debates and I have an impulse to convert to Catholicism, which I think is strange. And he said, well, would you like to talk about it? And I said, yes. So we went up to go talk in his room, and we kind of had a long discussion that greatly resembled the talk you've all just heard, where I kind of laid out all my problems. And with him, there were even more mathematical digressions, because then I had a sheet of paper and I could be drawing things and going, yes, Christianity, rather like this. Here, rather like, and he was patient, like some of the priests I'd met, sat through the whole thing. He said, okay, so your problem is you don't know how you have transcendental knowledge of morality. That's your problem, right? And I'm like, yes, that's my problem. And you don't have a satisfactory answer. And I said, yes. And he goes, all right, well, what do you think the answer is? And I said, well, I don't think it's very much like our knowledge of math. I don't think, and I started to do the feet and the objects again. He's like, no. You said that already in your big lead up from what your problem was. You've already said what you don't believe. It's probably not helpful to keep going over what you don't think the answer is. Say something new. Say something that could be the answer. You have to try throwing new things at the problem, not just going over again and again what you've already discarded. And I said, kind of just blurting it, well, I don't know. I guess morality just loves me or something. Ben had a bit of this cat that ate the canary grin on his face. I said, okay, I heard what I said. I don't know if it's true. Just because I say things doesn't mean they're true. So I kind of thought about it. And I think the reason I had blurted it out, when I just tried to even almost name the problem, is I had this issue where I thought, I have this transcendental knowledge, but it's not knowledge of math, which is kind of, I'll admit, morally neutral. Math is beautiful, but kind of morally neutral. But I had knowledge of the good, of what I ought to do, knowledge through my conscience. And I didn't have a way I was able to reach up and get it in the same way I could kind of bootstrap my way up to math. So if I wasn't reaching out and capturing knowledge of ethics, but I had it, the only kind of other explanation is that the motion was coming from the other direction. Not me reaching up, but it reaching down. But that really doesn't explain loves, right, in my comment. The issue is I'm already talking about kind of what I thought of as morality as this big, giant, beautiful rule book. I still had a few shades of Javert, you can tell, but this beautiful list of what was right and wrong. It's beautiful as mathematics, all beautifully formalized. But now I'm not talking about it as a rule book. If it can move, if it's offering itself to me, I'm talking about it like a person. And I'm talking about kind of ethics as a person. That's again different from math. If math were to do something, you might say, oh, anything math did, if math could act, must be logical, because what math does is entirely consistent with logic. But if morality acts, whatever it does must be good, because that's what morality is. Morality personified, as weird as that sounds to begin with, can't itself do bad things. So there was something good about it offering itself to me. And I still had the sense of love, and that I have less of a way to formalize, but that it was an act of generosity. When you talk about the form of the good, acting as a person, reaching down to meet humans with a particular care for them, no one says it like in quite that long way. No one goes like, oh yes, I believe in the form of the good that is active, that has a special care for humans and reaches to them. They say God. I could tell I was talking about God. And I'd kind of come really the long way around. I'd had to build up the language to even talk about it, from my experience with math and my experience with deontology, to even have a way of saying, God loves me, which is what normal people say, instead of the true, the good, and the beautiful is reaching. But I could tell I was talking about God, and I could tell, even that, the idea of the transcendental reaching down, it sounded like I was talking about an incarnational faith, in the same way that Christ comes down and dwells among us at a scale we can perceive, in a form we can recognize. That I had something of that sense of how morality reached down to me. And I had a lot to do going on from there. That night was the night I changed my mind. And my friend Ben and I danced around, and we prayed the Liturgy of the Hours, which was lovely, I was really lucky in having him to talk to, where I'm like, what should we do? And he's like, we should pray night office. That's what we should do. Which is, it wouldn't have even occurred to me then. And so that was kind of the conversion of my intellect in that moment, where God had kind of built up all the different tools I needed to see him at that moment. That it really wasn't possible for me to even hear the gospel story and have it make sense until I'd spent all that time wandering through deontology and virtue ethics and topology and weird bits of geometry. I needed all those pieces just to hear the message. And what's happened to me since is a lot of the task and the work of conversion of the heart, where I'm kind of now at that beginner level of all that discussion opened a new language to me, and now I have the opportunity to study it. A language of love and of mercy that isn't cowardice even, which was too alien for me to even express in kind of my native ethical tongue. And a lot of my work has been figuring out how to respond to it. As I actually discuss in my book, Arriving at Amen, 7 Catholic Prayers Even I Can Offer, a lot of it is building up a new language. All that to this date was just opening the door for me to study it. And so a lot of it has been, okay, well, now that I do want to pray for the next Madison I meet, how do I do it? Now that I do want to kind of spend adoration time with Christ, how do I do it? And a lot of the times what's happened for me is I fall back on the language I already know to kind of find my way to reach back up. I even had the problem shortly after my conversion where, I wasn't used to thinking about the true, the good, and the beautiful as having anything to do with God. I was used to thinking about math. So I'd have the problem where I'd be praying or trying to pray, and I'd just wind up, thinking about, well, I'm addressing like the true, the good, and the beautiful, and I'd start thinking about math. And I was like, well, I think this isn't how you pray. Like, I think you don't pray by thinking about theorems. And what I would kind of do is I go, well, I love these theorems, and God, who loves truth, loves these theorems. So this is something we share. I can think about, I was almost kind of that fumbling in reaching for God at that point. I'm like, I don't know how to reach for God, but I know I'm looking at this math, and he's looking at this math, and we both delight in this. And that's something that's shared between us, and I'd almost rely on that as the connection. In the same way you'd watch a movie with a friend and turn to each other and go, that was great. I'm like, okay, that's my prayer to God today. Gosh, the Riemann hypothesis is great. Don't you think so? Yeah, me too. I'm here, if you want to talk sometime about things that aren't the Riemann hypothesis, but that's what I know to offer you today. And so for me, that's been a lot of the process of conversion. It's been taking all the things I know and love and kind of offering them back up to God and getting to share in his delight, and even thinking, wow, I love the Riemann hypothesis so much, and so does God. But I guess he loves me even more than I love the Riemann hypothesis. Because, it's math and it's beautiful, but I'm, an adopted child of God. So what I feel for the Riemann hypothesis is this echo of what he feels for me. And so I've kind of found my way along all these little alleyways and along all these weird translational tricks to understand what it is that it means when you say, God loves me in the native tongue I speak. Thank you.